Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my prediction for the upcoming death battle between Sora and Pit. In this video, I will be going over the characters' backstories, their powers and capabilities, why these characters were paired against each other, and then finally, who I think is going to win. As for what I researched for this match, I have been a huge Kingdom Hearts fan for decades, so I already know everything there is to know about Sora. As for Pit, I covered all of his games, including his appearances in Super Smash Bros. As such, I am decently confident regarding who I think is going to win. Before I get into it, there are two clarifications I wish to make. First, I made a statement in my last video stating that I would be highballing everything from now on, and some of you were concerned that meant I was going to be blowing things out of proportion. That's not what I meant. When I say highballing, I mean I'm going to present the facts in the most positive light reasonably possible. I'm not going to pretend these characters can do things they cannot do. I simply aim to do the characters justice. That's all I meant. The second thing I wanted to clarify is with regards to what outside help I'm going to be covering. In case you didn't know, both combatants have access to forms of outside help that Death Battle may or may not allow. Death Battle's rule against outside help gets waived a lot, so I really have no idea what Death Battle will allow for this matchup. However, based off past fights, I can make an educated guess. As such, I will be covering the various powers granted to Pit by Lady Palutena, as those are pretty much a part of his standard arsenal. And for Sora, I will be including his drive forms, as those are an important part of his arsenal, and an argument could be made for that he doesn't need his party members to access them. However, I will not be including Sora's summons or Dream Eaters, as Death Battle has a tendency to not allow Final Fantasy-style summoning, and whether or not the Dream Eaters can even exist in physical reality is hard to judge. Also, I unfortunately ran out of time while making this, so the editing in this video won't be that great. I apologize in advance. With all that said, let's get into it. First up is Sora, the hero of light and the Keyblade's chosen one. Sora had a pretty normal life growing up on his home, the Destiny Islands. He spent most of his time hanging out with his two best friends, Riku and Kairi. Kairi is a girl, and the love interest. That is the beginning and end of her character. Riku, however, was Sora's rival, and they often competed in various physical activities, including sword fighting. However, everything changed when the Heartless attacked. Heartless are extra-dimensional monstrosities of purified darkness. They are the evil in people's hearts given physical form, and they ravenously devour everything in their path. If left unchecked, Heartless will devour entire planes of existence in their rampage, and Sora's home was next on the chopping block. Unfortunately, Sora just didn't have the means to stop the Heartless. He was just a kid. After seeing both Riku and Kairi mysteriously disappear, it seems certain that Sora would be consumed by the darkness. However, just as all seemed lost, a Keyblade manifested in Sora's hand. Keyblades are ancient weapons of unfathomable power, and they grant their wielders incredible abilities. However, Keyblades are somewhat sentient, and will only let themselves be wielded by someone they deem worthy. And Sora was this Keyblade's chosen wielder. He immediately had a boost to his fighting prowess, and proceeded to fight off wave after wave of Heartless. He even slew the powerful Heartless that was leading the invasion. But Sora was too late. The Heartless had done their dirty work, and Sora's entire home dimension was destroyed. Sora was sent tumbling through dimensions until he ended up on an entirely new world called Traverse Town. Here, Sora met up with a bunch of Disney and Final Fantasy characters to sort out what was going on, and Sora quickly learned that, as the Keyblade's chosen one, it was his destiny to save the universe. As such, Sora set out on an epic quest to find his friends and defeat the Heartless, and he succeeded. However, it quickly became clear that the Heartless were just the tip of the iceberg. There were many dark forces at play here, and it was up to Sora to combat them and save reality. And that's exactly what he has been doing ever since. That is the most bare-bones summary of Sora that I can give you. I'd love to go more in depth regarding Sora's story and the Kingdom Hearts universe, but we really don't have time for that here. Maybe I'll do it in another video. For now, let's just talk about what Sora can do. Sora's arsenal can be divided into 4 broad categories: Keyblade powers, physical techniques, magical abilities, and equipment. We'll start with his Keyblade powers. Not only is the Keyblade practically indestructible, but it can also teleport to its user's hand in an instant, or be telekinetically wielded from a distance. Sora likes to use these powers to throw the Keyblade like a boomerang and have it bombard foes repeatedly before teleporting back to his hand. However, easily the Keyblade's most iconic and significant power is the ability to lock or unlock anything. This can be used for mundane things like opening doors or chests, but it can also be used to open portals between alternate dimensions, or it can be used to actually lock or unlock someone's soul. Sora hasn't utilized this power in that way very much, making its exact side effects unclear, but it's still a dangerous power nonetheless. In fact, one of the main ways he uses this power in combat is to shoot an outright laser beam at foes, and while this can have the special locking and unlocking properties, it can also act as just a straight up death laser. It was this very technique that he used to finish off the final form of Xemnas, one of the most powerful entities Sora has ever encountered. But that's not the end of the Keyblade's abilities. It can also transform into a number of different shapes in order to give Sora various tactical advantages. Initially, Sora could only do this through key chains. This was a superficial way of enhancing the Keyblade's power through the use of special mementos. But after receiving training to become a true Keyblade master from Yen Sid, Sora was able to fully unlock the Keyblade's shape-shifting abilities. Now Sora can transform the Keyblade from a mere sword into any number of advanced weapons, including dual laser guns, a massive hammer, yo-yos, cannons, and so on. The exact limitations and full potential of the Keyblade's transformative properties are not clear at this time. Regardless, these are the powers and abilities unique to the Keyblade. Now let's cover Sora's unique physical powers and techniques. This is a very long list, so instead of going over each one individually, I'll instead have the more notable abilities on screen while I talk about them in general terms. Sora's various techniques generally center around bombarding foes with high-speed combos while throwing in more magical attacks every now and again. And while many of Sora's magical techniques rely upon a limited supply of magic power, he also has plenty of magic that he always has access to. Case in point, the explosion technique consists of Sora blasting nearby foes with raw magic, and the magnet spiral technique involves Sora using magnetic magic to draw enemies in before assaulting them. Regardless, Sora's high mobility, speed, and strength make his combos highly destructive and deadly, and since these combos often stun the opponent in various ways, getting hit by any of Sora's attacks will likely leave you too stunned to avoid the rest of his follow-up attacks. If it wasn't obvious, Sora's skill as a sword fighter is gargantuan. He is officially described as a master swordsman, and getting into melee combat with Sora is pretty much a death wish. Even utilizing ranged attacks to try and avoid Sora isn't too reliable, as Sora is more than skilled enough to deflect incoming projectiles back at his attackers. This makes combating Sora a very tricky affair for any opponent, and I cannot emphasize how naturally gifted Sora is as a fighter. Before receiving any Keyblade training at all, he had already created an entire arsenal of unique attacks and techniques that incorporate the various aspects of his powers. He even learned how to manipulate and channel his own aura to blast nearby foes with the Ripple Drive technique. It's also worth noting that many of Sora's fancier techniques have a magical property to them, and this magical property causes many of his attacks to bypass physical defenses entirely. This means that if an opponent isn't specifically wearing anti-magic armor, they are likely in for a beating. Those are Sora's physical techniques. Now let's look at his magical abilities. This is an even longer list, so I'm going to have his magic listed on screen in more general terms instead of going over each individual spell. Sora first unlocked the ability to use magic when he originally acquired the Keyblade, and he has been honing his magical skill ever since. He actually received training in the mystical arts by none other than Merlin himself. Yes, the Merlin who trained King Arthur. This has allowed Sora access to a wide range of magical attacks and techniques. Sora is capable of wielding and manipulating fire, water, ice, lightning, earth, wind, meteors, poison, gravity, magnetism, magical barriers, light, darkness, and even time itself. He can even use the Curaga spell to completely heal all his wounds. And that's just the basic magic at his disposal. Being the innovative combatant that he is, Sora has learned how to mix and match his various magics to create entirely unique attacks, including fiery tornadoes and healing light blasts. Sora has even learned how to magically teleport around the battlefield. He is also capable of inflicting a number of status effects upon enemies with his magic. He can make them fall asleep, shrink them down to miniature size, fill them with fear, or even cause them to transform into a bomb and explode. When you combine all this magic with Sora's physical techniques, he becomes a one-man army on the battlefield. Admittedly, his magical abilities mostly rely upon a limited pool of magical energy, and should he run out of that energy, he will be cut off from the majority of his magic. However, Sora's magical energy naturally regenerates over time, so even if it runs out, he'll typically recharge his magic in less than a minute. And he can significantly accelerate the speed at which he recovers that magic through the use of various powers, abilities, items, and equipment. Which is as good a segue as any for moving on to Sora's equipment. This being partially a Final Fantasy game, Sora has access to a vast array of armor and equipment. However, most of this equipment isn't very unique or noteworthy, so there's little point going over it in detail. Just know that Sora's equipment generally boosts his stats, abilities, and resistances. The most noteworthy aspect of Sora's armor and accessories is that, at any given time, they generally give Sora a significant degree of resistance to most forms of elemental damage. Aside from the generic stuff, Sora's outfit has a very special power that was imbued in it by 3 good fairies. Specifically, it allows Sora to enter drive forms. Drive forms are temporary transformations that boost Sora's combat ability significantly. However, it's debatable whether Death Battle will allow Sora to use drive forms, as in gameplay, Sora has to utilize the power of his teammates in order to access these forms. However, I would make the argument that that is just a gameplay mechanic, and that Sora can actually use them whenever he wants. The reason I say this is because in the one cutscene in which Sora uses a drive form, he enters Valor form, which normally makes Goofy disappear in gameplay. Yet despite that, Goofy is still clearly standing there and commentating. This says to me that Sora can use any of his drive forms whenever he wants, but that's just my opinion. Regardless, I will now cover what these drive forms consist of. First, I'll cover the 2 weird ones, specifically Limit Form and Anti-Form. Limit Form is the only drive form Sora can enter without the aid of his teammates. The main advantage of this form is that it grants Sora access to a number of powerful techniques called limits, which, if he successfully lands them, will heal Sora's health considerably. This is generally the only form people give Sora in versus debating, as it's the only form he doesn't need Donald or Goofy to access. Then there's Anti-Form. This form consists of Sora getting overwhelmed by darkness, and its combat style involves Sora discarding the Keyblade in favor of growing claws and bombarding foes with blindingly fast combo attacks, with the occasional blast of dark energy thrown in for good measure. This form cannot be entered of Sora's own free will, and it prevents him from using magic for the duration. As such, Anti-Form is generally seen as more of a curse than a blessing. Now let's cover the main drive forms. First up is Valor Form. This form is the first on his list that grants Sora the ability to wield 2 Keyblades simultaneously. This form significantly boosts Sora's physical abilities, allowing him to run faster, leap higher, and hit harder. The main combat strategy of this form is to aggressively bombard foes with wide-sweeping strikes that not only tend to block or deflect incoming attacks, but also tend to stun or otherwise disable enemies on hit, ensuring that, once caught in a combo, the enemy is stuck there until Sora finishes assaulting them. The main downside of this form is that Sora cannot use magic while wielding it, which forces him to rely upon items and allies in order to heal himself. Next up is Wisdom Form. This form grants Sora the ability to slide across the ground as if he was wearing skates, and it replaces his standard Keyblade strikes with the ability to fire magical energy bullets at a rapid pace. It also grants Sora the ability to dash at high speeds, but the main advantage of this form is that it significantly boosts the speed, power, and range of his magical spells. The main disadvantage of this form is that the energy blasts Sora fires aren't as strong as his regular melee attacks, meaning this form sacrifices power for range. Next up is Master Form. This form also allows Sora to use 2 Keyblades, although one of them he levitates telekinetically instead of holding in his hand. This form is effectively a fusion of Valor form and Wisdom form, as it grants Sora boosted magical abilities while also granting him powerful physical combos. However, Master Form is greater than the sum of its parts. In addition to the advantages provided by Valor and Wisdom, Sora can also chain magical attacks into his combos for wide-reaching blasts, and all of his combos in this form levitate Sora, and by extension his opponent, into the air, which effectively traps them until Sora is finished with them. However, even Master Form pales in comparison to Sora's ultimate transformation, Final Form. This form has Sora straight up levitating through the air, and he wields both of his Keyblades through telekinesis. In fact, even when Sora is not actively attacking, his Keyblades will swirl around him and strike nearby foes. This transformation draws from all of Sora's previous forms. It has the blinding speed of Anti-Form, the powerful physical strikes of Valor Form, the vast magical power of Wisdom Form, and the wide-reaching aerial combos of Master Form. The main difference with Final Form, however, is that it is just far more powerful than any of the other forms. It is described as being a form that draws out the Keyblade's true power, and it shows. Sora becomes a veritable meat grinder when he's in this form, and anyone foolish enough to get close is just shredded. Those are Sora's dry forms, however there's one more aspect of his equipment that deserves coverage: his consumable items. Sora is capable of carrying a limited number of magical potions into battle, and by consuming these potions, he gains a variety of different benefits. However, the best potion by far are the elixirs. By consuming an elixir, Sora is completely healed of all injuries, and his magical power is restored. Since he can carry as many as 8 of these elixirs, it takes a lot of effort to keep Sora down permanently. That's Sora's arsenal and abilities. Now let's cover base stats. First up is Strength. Sora is gargantuanly strong. He slices through skyscrapers like wet tissue paper, and he then launches those skyscrapers as projectiles as if they were baseballs. He was able to match and surpass the strength of the Ground Shaker, a kaiju-sized heartless so powerful that it caused earthquakes with its every step. Sora was able to block attacks from Cloud Strife, who can swing his sword with 1,600 tons of force. Sora was also able to block attacks from Sephiroth, who can swing his sword with over 3 billion newtons of force, which is comparable to over 385,000 tons of force. But most impressively, Sora was able to block attacks from Hercules. Unfortunately, Death Battle hasn't calculated the capabilities of Hercules, so we'll have to do it ourselves. Hercules' best feat comes from the end of his movie when he picked up and threw 4 mountain-sized titans into space. These titans were made of rock, lava, ice, and wind. It's worth mentioning that, due to the unique animation style of the Hercules movie, the exact size of the titans varies from scene to scene. But at their best, specifically during their initial rampage, they were so big that the Rock Titan was able to step over the horizon and crush an entire town beneath his foot. This confirms that they are indeed mountain-sized. Now to calculate their weight. The Rock Titan is the simplest since it's literally just a walking mountain. Mountains tend to weigh several billion tons, so we'll settle on 3 billion metric tons for the Rock Titan. The other titans would be more complex to calculate, and I frankly don't have the time to do so we'll instead assume that the other 3 titans combined together weigh about as much as the Rock Titan does by itself. They actually probably weigh a bit more, since the Lava Titan almost certainly weighs as much as the Rock Titan, but we'll just settle on 6 billion metric tons as the weight Hercules lifted. Now, he threw these titans into space, but we don't know the exact distance they traveled. However, in this instance, they traveled so far that they disappeared from sight, which means we can calculate the minimum distance they traveled using this handy formula. In order for an object to disappear from view, it must occupy less than 0.02 degrees of our vision. As such, as long as we have the height of the object, we can calculate the distance they must travel in order to disappear. For this, we'll assume the titans are around mountain height, which are, on the upper end of the spectrum, around 8,000 meters tall. We plug that into the formula and we find the titans would have had to travel over 17,000 miles in order to disappear, and they traveled this distance in 3 seconds, meaning Hercules threw them at speeds exceeding 20.5 million miles per hour. 6 billion metric tons traveling at that speed would be carrying over 60 billion megatons of energy. That's over 41,000 times the power of the entire world nuclear arsenal. And that's the power Hercules is packing behind his strikes, and Sora was able to block attacks from Hercules. That means Sora's strength is comparable to Hercules. Next is speed. Sora is fast enough to bounce bullets back at his attackers, he's fast enough to catch up to and deflect laser sniper shots, he regularly moves faster than the eye can track, and he was able to keep pace with Sephiroth's blinding speed. Sora was also able to keep pace with Larxene, who's effectively a lightning ninja, and judging by her movements in her battle, she too appears to move at speed comparable to lightning. But Sora's best speed feat comes from his final battle with Xemnas, in which he individually blocked and deflected countless laser beams bombarding him from all directions. These attacks are specifically referred to as lasers. Lasers are, by definition, composed of light, and thus travel at light speed, meaning Sora was able to track and deflect hundreds of light speed projectiles with just his Keyblade. Admittedly, he had Riku's aid, but even if Sora only blocked half of all these attacks, this feat still puts both his reaction speed and his attack speed well beyond the speed of light. And this was without any of the speed enhancements he gets from his drive forms. Next is durability. Thankfully, we've already done the heavy lifting on this one. Sora is tough enough to endure several strikes from the likes of Hercules, who can strike with over 60 billion megatons of force. And that's without Sora using any of his defensive magic such as Arrow. Throw in the fact that Sora can heal himself with magic and items, and putting Sora down for good is an incredibly difficult task. In terms of skill, Sora may not have the most extensive training or experience, but he is a natural in the ways of combat. He has successfully bested swordsmen with far more training and experience than himself time and time again, and Sora himself is officially referred to as a master swordsman in his own right. Sora regularly creates entirely new attacks and techniques, and he's even so skilled that he's learned how to outright copy the powers and abilities of the enemies he faces. Sora has even managed to duplicate complex magical powers after seeing them in action for only a few seconds. In terms of stamina, Sora regularly engages in lengthy battles with powerful warriors and entire armies. He once fought and defeated 1,000 Heartless by himself, and afterwards all he needed was a second to catch his breath. In terms of intelligence, Sora may not be the brightest cookie in the jar, but when it comes to combat he can be quite cunning. The fact that he is able to mimic complex techniques and magic is a testament to his capability, and many times he's fought foes who required quite a bit of cunning and strategy in order to defeat, such as the Phantom Heartless, who Sora had to wield and combine a vast array of magical powers in different ways to combat. In terms of versatility, Sora's vast arsenal of magical, physical, and Keyblade powers makes him prepared to handle pretty much any opponent. And in terms of mobility, Sora is of course very fast, but he is also capable of magical flight. In addition, he is even capable of magical teleportation. This makes escaping Sora quite a difficult task for even the quickest of foes. In terms of particular combat feats, Sora has bested kaiju-sized monsters and entire armies, and he's defeated a number of powerful heroes and villains in single combat. He has defeated Hercules, Cloud Strife, Tifa Lockhart, Yippee, Squall Leonhardt, Hades, god of the underworld, both the Rock Titan and the Ice Titan, and he's even defeated the terrifying Sephiroth on 2 separate occasions. Needless to say, with the masterful magic of a sorcerer and the physical prowess of a god, there are very few opponents that Sora cannot handle. Now let's talk weaknesses. The primary flaw with Sora is that he tends to rely quite heavily on his friends for support. They have always been there to back him up, and there were a number of fatal situations that Sora would not have escaped without their aid. They are particularly useful when it comes to realizing they are being manipulated, as Sora himself is infamously naive. He is not a particularly difficult person to trick, and his foes have easily led him into traps time and time again. And while Sora's powers do give him some long-range options, he is first and foremost a melee fighter, and many foes have prolonged their battles with Sora by simply keeping out of his reach. Sora also doesn't have the most experience or training. He's only been an active combatant for a few years, and he's only been getting proper training for, at most, a year. And while it's true that Sora can regenerate his magical power, that does still take at least a few seconds, which leaves windows open during which foes have an advantage. And while he can instantly replenish his magic with elixirs, he can only carry a limited number of elixirs into battle. That's everything I know about Sora. Now let's cover Pit, the captain of Palutena's army and the savior of Angel Land. Long ago in the age of myths and monsters, the gods and humanity lived together in peace, with the goddess Palutena ruling over the light of Angel Land and the goddess Medusa ruling over the dark. But whereas Palutena loved humanity and sought to aid them, Medusa took pleasure in torturing them and ruining their crops. As punishment, Palutena transformed Medusa into a horrible monster and banished her to the underworld. Medusa would not stand for this, of course. After building an army out of the underworld's denizens, Medusa proceeded to conquer all of Angel Land. She imprisoned Palutena and turned her entire army of angels into stone statues. However, all was not lost. Using the last of her power, Palutena freed Pit, the captain of her army, who had been imprisoned deep within the underworld, and she gave him one mission: collect the 3 sacred treasures and defeat Medusa. And Pit did just that. He fought his way through the underworld, fought his way through the surface world, and then finally fought his way through Angel Land. And with all 3 sacred treasures in hand, Pit slew the dark goddess Medusa and saved the world. But Medusa wasn't the last dark conqueror Pit would have to face. Later on, the archdemon Orcos would attempt to conquer Angel Land, but Pit was better prepared this time. He had already gone on a quest to collect the 3 sacred treasures, and he promptly slew the archdemon shortly after he arrived. However, Pit's greatest nemesis would come later, in the form of the ruler of the underworld himself, Hades. Hades was so powerful that he resurrected Medusa as a mere pawn in his plans, and he even destroyed the 3 sacred treasures that had been so effective in the past. But Pit wouldn't let that stop him. After rallying his allies of gods and mortals, Pit engaged in one final climactic battle against Hades, and in the end just barely managed to vanquish the Dark Lord. The world had been saved by Pit once again, and he has continued to defend the planet ever since. That's Pit's story. Now let's talk about what he can do. Pit is, obviously, an angel, but he is different from most angels in that he lacks the ability to fly. Despite the wings obviously present on his back, Pit can only engage in flight when Palutena herself grants him that power. But make no mistake, like many great heroes before him, Pit's handicap only served to strengthen his resolve, and he made up for his lack of flight by training to be the best dang warrior he could possibly be, and the results speak for themselves. There's a reason he's the leader of Palutena's army. In fact, despite his youthful appearance, Pit is actually quite the grizzled veteran, as he's been successfully leading Palutena's army for over 25 years. But that's enough vague summarization, let's get into his arsenal. We'll start with the weapons. Pit has access to 108 separate weapons that he is capable of carrying into battle, and these weapons can be divided into blades, staves, claws, bows, palms, clubs, cannons, orbiters, and arms. Despite the primitive sounding names, these weapons are actually highly sophisticated technology that are kinda similar to the weapons from Ruby, in that every single one of these doubles as both a melee weapon and as a ranged weapon. The ranged weapons in particular tend to fire lasers, bombs, bullets, and so on, and these various projectiles tend to home in on enemies. Also, each weapon type has its own unique special attack. However, 108 weapons is a bit too much for me to cover, so instead I'll have the descriptions of each weapon class on screen while I describe their general properties. First up is blades. Blades have the appearance of laser guns, but they can also form an energy blade out of the tip for melee combat. In other words, in close quarters, they basically act as lightsabers. Blades generally have balanced melee and range capabilities. The special attack of blades is to summon lightning down upon enemies. Next up are staves. Staves are effectively magical sniper rifles in that they excel at firing extremely long-range shots, but they are poorly suited for melee combat. They also lack the homing quality of other weapon types, making aiming more difficult. Equipping a staff also slows Pit's movement considerably. The special attack of staves is to fire a single linear energy blast that deals high damage at long range. Next up are claws. Claws specialize in high-speed, close-range combat. The main method of attack with claws is to bombard foes with multi-strike combo attacks. Pit can run much faster while wielding claws, and the special attack of claws consists of Pit spinning around very fast while the claws produce an onslaught of whirlwind projectiles that cut through enemies. However, the projectiles fired by claws don't home in on enemies very well, and claws tend to lack in terms of long-range combat. Next up is bows. Bows specialize in firing high-speed shots with strong homing capabilities. Bows tend to be Pit's most iconic weapon type. The special attack of bows consists of Pit firing a barrage of arrows upwards, which then rain down upon his foes. Bows split into twin blades for melee combat, but aren't as good in melee as other weapon types, and have a lower rate of fire. Next up are palm weapons. Palm weapons are magical runes tattooed onto Pit's arm. These runes fire out magical blasts for ranged attacks, and in melee combat they simply enhance Pit's strikes with magical energy. The special attack of palms consists of Pit summoning a large ball of energy, which then explodes and sends out projectiles in all directions. Palms are very light, allowing Pit high movement speed, and they specialize in having very high homing and fire rates, but they tend to have lower attack power and lower range than other weapon types. Next are clubs. Clubs are very powerful melee weapons, although their ranged capabilities are limited. To make up for this, clubs can deflect projectiles back at foes, and its charge shots are both powerful and capable of penetrating walls. However, they slow the user considerably, have no continuous fire, and have shortened melee combos. Their special attack consists of Pit summoning several tornadoes to damage enemies. Next are cannons. Cannons are massive weapons that fit over Pit's arm and are basically grenade launchers. Cannons specialize in explosive charge shots that affect a wide area, but they slow Pit considerably and aren't very good in melee combat. Their special attack consists of Pit delivering a massive explosive blast that deals high damage to everything on screen. Next are orbiters. Orbiters are twin orbs that levitate around Pit and can fire energy blasts. In melee combat, they twirl around Pit and smash into foes. They excel at long-range combat as they have strong homing and have very high fire rate due to them firing from two orbs at once. And their small size rarely slows Pit's movement. However, they lose effectiveness in close-range combat. Their special attack fires multiple balls of energy that fly around and smash enemies. And last but not least are arms. Arms are large, blunt weapons that fit over Pit's entire arm, hence the name, and are effectively a combination of the cannon and the club. Arms specialize in versatility and power, and as such deal high damage in both close range and long range combat. Their special attack consists of Pit unleashing a flurry of punches at everything nearby. However, arms tend to have more limited range and slow attack speed. Those are all of Pit's weapons. However, he cannot carry all of them into battle simultaneously. Whenever going out on a mission, Pit has to pick one weapon which he must exclusively use until the mission is completed. Which weapon he takes is entirely up to the player, which raises the question of which weapon is he going to bring into the death battle. Thankfully, Death Battle has already set precedents for how to handle player customization, which is to look at the fighting games, and we need look no further than Super Smash Bros. 4 in order to see which weapons Pit prefers to carry. Actually, in Super Smash Bros., Pit carries 3 weapons, so that's already an improvement. He carries the Palutena Bow, the Upper Dash Arm, and the Guardian Orbiters. Since these are his preferred weapons, we'll cover them in a little more depth. The Palutena Bow, otherwise known as the Sacred Bow of Palutena, was crafted by the goddess herself, and is Pit's most iconic weapon. The arrows fired by this bow deal more damage when Pit is dashing, which encourages a fighting style all about hastily dodging around the battlefield while bombarding foes. It can fire charge shots or rapid fire, and the shots it fires travel at incredible speeds and have a powerful homing ability, which makes it incredibly difficult to dodge Pit's arrows. In melee combat, it splits into 2 short swords, which Pit uses to great effectiveness. The main drawback of this weapon is that it just doesn't have that much power when used in melee combat, so it's a good thing Pit has access to the Upper Dash Arm. This device fires ring shots when used as a ranged weapon, but its bread and butter is melee combat. While its standard strikes aren't that powerful, its dash attacks deal massive damage and can launch foes into the air. but sometimes the best offense is a good defense, at which point Pit falls back on the Guardian Orbiters. This device isn't too effective when used offensively, as it generally lacks range and power, but its defensive applications are immense. To be precise, the charged shots of this weapon create massive defensive shields that protect Pit from incoming projectiles. This acts as a fantastic defense mechanism anytime Pit is starting to get overwhelmed. Those are Pit's standard weapons, but should he ever face a truly mighty foe, he'll bust out the 3 sacred treasures. These consist of the light arrows, the mirror shield, and the wings of Pegasus. The light arrows are a form of ammunition that are made entirely of light, meaning they travel at light speed. This makes them practically impossible to dodge, and they're powerful enough to punch through solid metal with ease. The mirror shield is a shield that actually bounces incoming projectiles back at attackers, and the wings of Pegasus allow Pit to fly without the aid of Palutena. This is pretty significant because when Palutena grants Pit the power of flight, her version only lasts 5 minutes, and should he fly longer than that, his wings will actually burn away, which is pretty gruesome when you think about it. Also, there is technically a 4th sacred treasure called the Silver Armor, which halves all damage Pit receives. However, should the 3 sacred treasures prove to be insufficient for defeating a foe, Pit can bust out his ultimate weapon, the Great Sacred Treasure. The Great Sacred Treasure is, for all intents and purposes, a Gundam. It's an advanced mech suit that Pit can climb into, and it is incredibly powerful. In fact, it was only with the aid of this machine that Pit was able to defeat Hades at all. The Great Sacred Treasure is capable of launching a wide variety of projectiles, including lasers, missiles, fire, electricity, whirlwinds, water, shots that pull enemies towards it, and a mega laser beam attack. It can even form a giant laser sword. It also has greatly enhanced strength, speed, and durability, although I'll cover those when I get to base stats. It is also capable of high-speed flight and short-range teleportation. The Great Sacred Treasure also has the ability to take on new forms by discarding parts of itself. Doing so decreases its firepower in exchange for boosting its speed. Including its base form, the Great Sacred Treasure has 4 total forms. There's also one final segment to Pit's arsenal, which are items. Pit doesn't carry items into battle, rather he just occasionally stumbles across them while on missions. Still, they are quite useful, so I will briefly show the more impressive ones on screen. The main gist of these items is that they provide Pit a single-use attack to help turn the tides against a wave of opponents. These items range from bombs to elemental attacks to conjuring turrets. The main drawback of these items is that Pit cannot carry them into battle, and instead he has to locate them on site. Also, Pit is only capable of carrying 1 item at a time. Those are the items, which means we've pretty much covered Pit's arsenal. However, there's also a set of special powers that Pit can equip before heading out on a mission. These are powers granted by Palutena, and while they may count as outside help, I'll go ahead and list the more impressive ones on screen just in case. These powers tend to be the main tool Pit uses for defending himself on missions, as these powers can grant him things like temporary invulnerability, or they can just straight up heal him. Pit can only equip a limited number of these abilities at any given time, although exactly how many he can equip depends on which powers he chooses. However, as a general rule of thumb, Pit can typically equip about 6 powers at once. It's worth noting that Palutena can also grant Pit the power of flight in addition to these powers, although, like I said, it can only last 5 minutes. Alright, that's pretty much everything in Pit's modern arsenal. Now let's cover his base stats. In terms of strength, Pit can smash through solid stone and even solid metal with ease. He could even destroy a building-sized boulder with a single strike. But one of his best strength feats come from him being able to move a massive iron ball. Using some rough estimation and some highballing for good measure, I estimate this ball to weigh at most 867,671 pounds, or 434 US tons. That means Pit is strong enough to move weight comparable to 2 blue whales. But it's when we get to speed that Pit really shines. There's a lot of types of speed to talk about here, including ground speed, air speed, and reaction speed, but we'll start with ground speed. While on the ground, Pit was fast enough to keep pace with and dodge attacks from Phosphora, an electrical nymph warrior capable of moving at lightning speeds. Admittedly, Phosphora was already wounded when she fought Pit, so she wasn't fighting at her best, but it still seems likely that Pit would need close to lightning speed in order to best her. While in the air, Pit's speed is a little harder to judge. This is due to his best speed feats being impossible to measure. You see, Pit has flown into space on multiple occasions, but exactly how far he travels into space is unclear. This is due to the fact that outer space in the Kid Icarus universe doesn't work the same way it does in reality. For example, at one point, Pit had to stop some space pirates who were stealing the constellations, yet instead of being made of giant stars like they are in reality, these constellations are made of weird building-sized balls of light. And that's just one example. And since outer space clearly doesn't follow much of the rules of reality's version, there's no realistic way to judge the speed needed to travel within that space. To be fair, I am absolutely certain Pit is reaching escape velocity, which is just over 25,000 miles per hour. However, I'm also quite certain Pit can fly faster than that. I'd like to say he can fly at lightning speeds, but that is also clearly not the case. Anytime a lightning speed character shows up, such as Phosphora or the Lightning Chariot, they leave Pit in the dust when it comes to airspeed. So, while we know Pit's minimum speed and we know his maximum, I can't really pinpoint his exact limit. The most I can say is that Pit's flight speed rests somewhere between escape velocity and lightning speed. Now, Pit's speed in the Great Sacred Treasure is much more impressive and also much more measurable, but I'll get to that in a minute. Next up is durability. Pit is one tough cookie. He has survived all manner of attacks from all sorts of gods and monsters, many of them wielding city-busting levels of power. But his greatest adversary was most certainly Hades. Pit was even able to endure a straight punch to the face from Hades. But how strong is Hades? To calculate that, I used a scene from their final battle in which Hades leapt straight up into the air at speed so fast that he disappeared from sight in less than a second. Since he managed this with the power of his own physical body, we can calculate this to judge the power of his physical strikes he used on Pit. Now, in order to calculate this, we'll have to come up with a number to use to represent Hades' weight. Unfortunately, he's a magical god, so his exact weight could literally be anything. However, for the sake of math, we'll assume he weighs as much as a human would if they were his size. For the record, I estimate that Hades likely stands between 75 and 125 feet tall, but for the sake of highballing, we'll just round up and say he stands 150 feet tall. For calculating his weight, I will be falling back on the method Death Battle presented in Power Rangers vs. Voltron, in which they stated that doubling the height of an object typically results in its weight increasing by a factor of 8. Following that logic, a regular human who has had his size increased to 150 feet tall would weigh around 3.5 million pounds, or 1,795 US tons. That's weight. Now we need to calculate the speed of Hades' jump. For this, we'll fall back on the same equation we used for the Hercules feat. In this instance, Hades leapt up into the air so quickly that he disappeared from sight in about 0.8 seconds. In order for an object standing 150 feet tall to disappear from sight like that, he would have to travel 515,000 feet, or just under 98 miles. Since he traveled that distance in 0.8 seconds, that would mean he's traveling about 439,000 miles per hour. So when we combine that speed with this weight, we find that Hades must be capable of exerting energy comparable to 7.5 megatons. That's over 500 times the energy of the nuclear bomb that fell on Hiroshima. And Pit was able to tank such an attack to the face. With that, we have now covered Pit's strength, speed, and durability. Now, however, let's look at the strength, speed, and durability of the Great Sacred Treasure. In terms of strength, the Great Sacred Treasure, at full power, was able to actually match a blow from Hades. That means it has strength comparable to 7.5 megatons. In terms of speed, the Great Sacred Treasure was unable to keep up with Hades in its base form, but by discarding one piece of itself and transforming into its second form, it was actually able to surpass Hades in speed. Since Hades was moving 439,000 miles per hour, or Mach 572.8, the Great Sacred Treasure would have to be moving even faster than that. that would actually make the second form of the Great Sacred Treasure twice the speed of lightning. And since the later forms boost its speed even higher, its max speed is even greater than that. Unfortunately, I can't say with certainty how fast it is in its final form, but if I were to throw out a guess, I'd say it's probably around Mach 1168, or 4 times the speed of lightning. Of course, that is just a wild guess. Its speed is probably a bit slower than that, but I'd say this makes for a nice upper limit to the Great Sacred Treasure's speed. Now for durability, the Great Sacred Treasure is at its peak in its first form, in which it can trade blows with Hades and remain intact. That would mean its peak durability is likely several times greater than 7.5 megatons. However, as the Great Sacred Treasure moves on into its later forms, its durability decreases, to the point that a single solid strike from Hades was enough to annihilate it in its final form. As such, when looking at the whole spectrum, the Great Sacred Treasure's durability ranges from somewhere around 30 megatons to just below 7.5 megatons. That's it for the primary base stats, but there's still a few secondary stats to cover. In terms of skill, Pit is arguably the greatest fighter the world has ever seen. He's been an active warrior for nearly 3 decades, and he has superb combat training. He has even managed to take down gods with literally centuries of experience, showcasing just how gifted Pit is in the ways of warfare. In terms of stamina, Pit has taken down entire armies of monsters on his own, and he regularly goes on lengthy missions that require him to combat entire fortresses filled with enemies. In terms of intelligence, Pit isn't the brightest cookie in the jar, but when it comes to combat, he's a natural. He regularly has to battle enemies with complex strengths and weaknesses that require quick thinking and high skill in order to defeat. In terms of versatility, Pit's vast arsenal gives him pretty much everything he needs to take down any foe. Of course, Pit cannot carry his entire arsenal at once, which means getting some intel on his enemy before starting a mission is often necessary. But with sufficient prep time, there has been no foe too tough for Pit to handle. In terms of mobility, Pit is of course very fast, but he's also capable of magical flight and even magical teleportation when utilizing the Great Sacred Treasure or specific powers. This makes escaping Pit a difficult task for any character. In terms of particular combat feats, Pit has bested entire armies of monsters, warriors, and aliens. He's also bested a vast number of gods and elite warriors, including Medusa, Orcos, Phosphora, Hades, and many, many others. With such skill, weapons, and the literal power of the gods on his side, there is no foe in heaven or earth that Pit cannot handle. Now let's talk weaknesses. First and foremost, Pit is heavily dependent on Palutena for just about everything. She lets him fly, she grants him powers, she comes up with the battle strategies, she makes his weapons, she gives him healing items, and without her, Pit wouldn't have accomplished much of anything in his final adventure. She is absolutely the brains behind this operation, and without her advice, many of Pit's opponents simply wouldn't have been beatable. There have been numerous fatal situations Pit never would have escaped without aid. In fact, Pit has actually died a number of times over the course of his career. It's just that Palutena keeps reviving him. In addition, Pit himself has a number of flaws. He really isn't that bright, to the point that he doesn't even know how to read. He's also more than a tad naive. And while Pit's arsenal is impressive, he can typically only carry one weapon and one item into battle at a time, and since he has to locate items in missions in order to use them, this makes a large portion of his arsenal rather unreliable. As such, Pit's realistic versatility in any given situation is actually rather mediocre. Also, while Pit can use healing items and healing powers in order to restore his health, they all run on a limited supply, which means his total healing ability will eventually run dry. This makes a war of attrition one Pit will eventually lose. Also, while Pit can succeed in melee combat, his specialty is ranged combat, so against a foe who is impervious to projectiles, Pit's effectiveness as a combatant decreases dramatically. That's everything I know about these characters. Before I get to my prediction, here's all their similarities and or reasons for the matchup. 1. Both are naive heroes of light who've saved the world several times. 2. Both utilize a vast arsenal that includes melee, ranged, and magical combat. 3. Both rely heavily on their friends and allies. 4. Both are from series that take way too long to get sequels out. 5. Both have defeated armies of monsters, demons, and gods, including Hades. 6. Both are capable of magical flight and have transforming weapons that shoot lasers. And 7. Both are from series that bounce between cartoonishly silly and deadly serious at the drop of a hat. That's all the reasons for the match. Now for my prediction. I think the winner of this death battle will be Sora. I mean, you all saw this coming. I am so biased in favor of Sora that you guys knew I was gonna pick him. I did my best to do Pit the justice he deserves, but ultimately, I cannot see him winning this fight. Again, maybe that's because of bias, but here's my best arguments for why I think Sora should win. Looking at their base stats, Sora dominates in raw strength. The fact that he casually matches and surpasses Hercules in direct physical combat proves that, and Hercules is simply far stronger than anything in the Kid Icarus universe. However, when we move on to speed, things get a little more complicated. Generally speaking, Sora is much faster on land, what with his light speed combat capabilities. However, Sora's magical flight is nothing compared to Pit's, so Pit is faster in the air. So, in a way, they are somewhat even in this category. However, since Sora's ground speed is so much greater than Pit's aerial speed, it seems probable that Sora takes this category as well. However, things really start to go in Sora's favor when we get to durability. Pit is tough, make no mistake. You could vaporize a city with him inside it and he'd get right back up. But with the Hercules feat, Sora's durability is leagues beyond that. To be perfectly frank, you could hit Pit with an attack powerful enough to vaporize a city, and he'd still be standing. But you could hit Sora with an attack powerful enough to wipe out all life on the planet, and he'd shrug it off. That is the difference in their durability. And realistically, this wins Sora the fight by itself. Pit has no attack even remotely on that level, which means he is simply incapable of killing Sora, which means this fight is already over. And even if he could hurt Sora, Sora's reflexes and defensive barriers means he's more than capable of blocking, deflecting, or dodging any attack Pit throws his way. As such, Pit would be lucky to scratch Sora, not to mention kill him. But let's check out secondary stats as well. In terms of skill, Pit may have more formal combat training and experience, but Sora has bested similarly trained warriors before. As such, I'd say Pit is likely better at ranged combat, whereas Sora is likely better at melee combat. In other words, they're quite even in terms of skill. In terms of stamina, once again, they are somewhat comparable, as they have both battled entire armies on their own. So this category is also a draw. However, in terms of intelligence, I would absolutely have to give this to Sora. Sure, neither character is a genius, but Pit relies entirely upon Palutena when it comes to strategy. And while Sora may rely on his friends for support, Sora's friends are as stupid as he is, which means when Sora needs to defeat a complex or tricky opponent, he has to figure out the battle strategy himself. By contrast, Pit just does whatever Palutena tells him to do. In terms of versatility, this goes heavily to Sora. While both of them have wide arsenals that are somewhat comparable, Sora can use all of his powers and capabilities at the same time, whereas Pit can only carry a limited number of weapons and items. And even if you were to give Pit his entire arsenal at once, Sora's arsenal still has powers that Pit has no way to counter. Most notably, Sora can stop time, which is something Pit has no means of dealing with whatsoever. In fact, stopping time pretty much nullifies any advantage Pit may have built up. Once time is stopped, there's nothing preventing Sora from eviscerating Pit. In terms of mobility, again, they're pretty much even. Both can fly and teleport. Although, like I said, since Sora can stop time and has light speed attacks, that pretty much gives him the advantage in this category too. In short, These characters are surprisingly well matched in a number of categories, but the advantages Sora does have are so insurmountably huge that Pit just has no means of stacking up. Sora just hits too hard, is too tough, and is far too magically capable. And ultimately, Sora has fought and bested people very similar to Pit time and time again, whereas Pit has never fought anyone quite like Sora. As such, I am putting my money on Sora winning this death battle. Now for my Devil's Advocate section, in which I discuss how the other character might win. The only way I could see Pit winning is if Death Battle used his feats of flying into space to give him some sort of massively faster than light speed feat. In addition, I think Death Battle would also have to lowball Sora and exclude any feats occurring outside of the Kingdom Hearts games, such as the Hercules movie feat. It would also help Pit if they gave him everything Palutena is capable of, while also excluding all of Sora's dry forms and things. Of course, even if they did all of that, I personally don't see Pit winning, but doing that would certainly give him a better chance. Anyway, that's it for my prediction, which means we reached the end of the video. I do hope Sora wins this fight. This is easily one of the most personally significant death battles I've ever seen, so I am heavily invested. Everyone and their grandmother seems convinced Sora will win, but I'm still incredibly nervous. Anyway, apologies in advance to all the Kid Icarus fans out there. I'm sure my bias probably skewed something in some way, but I did my best to do Pit justice. The dude is quite powerful. He would wipe the floor with most death battle combatants. And if it makes you guys feel better, I honestly believe Pit poses a greater threat to Sora than Sephiroth ever did. Regardless, this video has gone on long enough, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and sign off. As for the ending pun, I'd go with Pit just didn't have the heart for this battle. 'Cause it's called Kingdom Hearts. Yee. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.